The morning alarm echoed through the metal halls of Nexus Station like it did every day at exactly 600 hours. Tae-ho Kim rolled out of his narrow bunk and landed softly on the cold floor. His roommate Dong-woo Lee was already awake, sitting at the small desk they shared, reading something on his datapad. The room was barely big enough for 2 beds and the desk, but it was more space than Tae-ho had expected when he first arrived at the Stellar Defense Academy 3 weeks ago. Dong-woo looked up from his pad and smiled. He always smiled in the morning, which Tae-ho found strange, but not unpleasant. Most people at the academy were friendly enough, but they kept their distance from him. Not because they disliked him, but because he was quiet and rarely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. He preferred it that way. "Big day today," Dong-woo said as he stretched his arms above his head. "Commander Choi is showing us some real combat footage in tactical analysis class. She says it's something special that just came in from the research division." Tae-ho nodded and pulled on his gray academy uniform. The fabric was rough but clean, and it fit him well enough. Everything at the academy was functional rather than comfortable, which suited him fine. He had learned not to expect comfort from life. The 2 cadets made their way through the corridors toward the mess hall. Nexus Station was huge, housing over 10,000 students and instructors from dozens of different species. The hallways were wide enough for the larger alien species to move comfortably, and the walls were painted a neutral beige color that supposedly helped different species feel at ease. Tae-ho thought it just looked boring, but he kept that opinion to himself. In the mess hall, they grabbed their breakfast trays and found seats at one of the long metal tables. The food was bland but nutritious, designed to meet the dietary needs of as many species as possible. Tae-ho ate mechanically, listening to the conversations around him without really participating. Other cadets talked about their home worlds, their families, their dreams of becoming great officers in the Galactic Fleet. He had nothing to contribute to those conversations. After breakfast, they walked to the main lecture hall for their tactical analysis class. The room was enormous, with tiered seating that could hold nearly 500 students. Today it was about half full, with cadets from various species scattered throughout the seats. Tae-ho and Dong-woo found spots near the back, which was where Tae-ho preferred to sit. From there, he could see everything without being noticed. Commander Bora Choi entered the room precisely on time. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Everyone said she was one of the best tactical minds in the human fleet, and Tae-ho believed it. She had a way of explaining complex battle strategies that made them seem simple and obvious. "Good morning, cadets," Commander Choi said as she walked to the front of the room. Her voice carried easily to the back rows without her needing to shout. "Today we're going to examine something unusual. Yesterday, our research teams finished analyzing data recovered from a derelict station in the Kepler system. Among the files they found was combat footage from an incident that occurred 3 months ago." She touched a control on her wrist, and the lights dimmed. A massive holographic display appeared above the center of the room, showing the darkness of space dotted with stars. In the center of the display was a small rocky planet surrounded by a field of asteroids. "This is Kepler 442b, Commander Choi continued. "It was a mining colony with a population of just over 3,000 humans. The colony was attacked by a species we had never encountered before. Our xenobiology department has classified them as ravagers based on their behavior patterns." The display shifted to show sleek, dark ships moving through space. They looked organic rather than mechanical, with curved hulls that reminded Tae-ho of insect shells. There were dozens of them, moving in coordinated groups toward the planet. Tae-ho felt his hands begin to tremble. He clenched them into fists and pressed them against his legs, hoping Dong-woo wouldn't notice. The ships on the display looked exactly like the ones he remembered, the ones that had destroyed everything he had ever cared about. "The attack began at 1400 hours local time," Commander Choi said. "The colony's defenses were minimal, as most mining operations are considered low-risk assignments. The Ravagers overwhelmed the defensive platforms within minutes." The holographic display showed the battle unfolding. The alien ships moved like a swarm, coordinating their attacks with deadly precision. Small explosions blossomed on the planet's surface as the colony's buildings were destroyed one by one. Tae-ho watched his homeworld die again, this time from the perspective of someone who hadn't been there. What happened next defies all known tactical doctrine, Commander Choi said. Her voice had taken on a tone of puzzlement. A single mining vessel emerged from the asteroid field and began engaging the Ravager fleet. A new ship appeared on the EIA display. It was ugly and functional, built for hauling ore rather than fighting. Compared to the sleek Ravager vessels, it looked like a flying brick. But as Taeho watched, the mining ship began moving in ways that should have been impossible for such a clumsy-looking craft. Over the next 72 hours, this lone vessel systematically destroyed 47 Ravager ships while sustaining minimal damage, Commander Choi said. The tactical computer estimates the probability of survival for such an engagement at less than 1 in 10 million. The room was completely silent now. Even the alien cadets, who usually whispered among themselves during lectures, were staring at the display in fascination. Taeho could feel his heart beating so hard he was sure everyone around him could hear it. The mining ship on the display moved through the asteroid field like it belonged there. It used the rocks as cover, emerging at unexpected angles to strike at the Ravager vessels before disappearing again. Each attack was perfectly timed, hitting the alien ships at their most vulnerable points. It was like watching a dance, if dances involved explosions and death. The pilot's identity remains unknown, Commander Choi said. Colony records indicate that all certified pilots were killed in the initial attack. Whoever was flying this vessel had no formal military training, yet they demonstrated tactical brilliance that our best strategists are struggling to understand. Instructor Jan Sik, the Velkarian professor who taught advanced warfare tactics, raised one of his 4 arms. His species was tall and thin, with pale blue skin and large eyes that could see across multiple light spectrums. Commander Choi, how do we know this footage is authentic? Such maneuvers seem to violate basic physics. Commander Choi nodded. The research team ran extensive verification protocols. The footage is genuine. We've also confirmed it with sensor data from nearby monitoring stations. What you're seeing actually happened. She paused the display on an image of the mining ship firing some kind of improvised weapon at a Ravager vessel. The alien ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its hull cracking open like an egg. The pilot used mining equipment in ways it was never designed for, Commander Choi explained. Drilling lasers became precision weapons. Ore containers became kinetic missiles. Even the ship's waste disposal system was somehow turned into a defensive mechanism. Cadet Yu Jin Nam, who sat a few rows ahead of Taeho, raised her hand. She was one of the top students in their year, specializing in xenobiology. What happened to the pilot after the battle? Unknown, Commander Choi replied. The mining ship's computer core was damaged early in the engagement, so we have no record of internal communications. Search and rescue teams found the vessel 3 days later, heavily damaged, but still functional. There was no one aboard. The display continued showing the battle footage. Taeho watched himself fighting for his life, using every trick his father had taught him about flying in asteroid fields. He saw the moment when he'd figured out how to turn the mining charges into guided missiles. He remembered the desperation and rage that had driven him to keep fighting long after any sane person would have given up. We'll be studying this footage extensively over the next several weeks, Commander Choi said. I want each of you to think about what lessons we can learn from this unknown pilot. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior technology or training, but from pure determination and creative thinking. The lights came back up, and the holographic display faded away. Around the room, cadets began talking excitedly about what they had seen. Taeho sat perfectly still, staring at the spot where the display had been. His hands were shaking again, and this time he couldn't make them stop. Dongwoo leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Taeho forced himself to nod. He had seen a ghost, his own. The footage began 3 months earlier on a day that had started like any other on Kepler 442b. Taeho had been working in the maintenance bay of his father's mining operation, checking the hydraulic systems on the ore haulers. The work was routine, but important, because a broken hauler in the asteroid field could mean death for its crew. His father had taught him that attention to detail wasn't just about efficiency, it was about keeping people alive. The first sign of trouble came when the communication arrays started picking up strange signals from the edge of the system. Taeho's father, Captain Jin-Woo Kim, had been in the command center when the alerts began flashing red across every screen. The signals were unlike anything in their databases, but they were clearly artificial and heading directly toward the colony. Taeho remembered running to the command center when the emergency alarms started blaring. Through the reinforced windows, he could see the asteroid field where he had spent most of his childhood learning to pilot mining ships. The rocks drifted lazily in their ancient dance around the small planet, unchanged by the panic spreading. Through the colony below, the defense platforms were the first to open fire. Kepler 442b had 6 automated weapon stations positioned around the planet, designed to deal with pirates or the occasional aggressive wildlife. They were never meant to face a full military assault. On the tactical display, Taeho watched the platforms fire their missiles at the approaching ships. Most of the missiles simply vanished before reaching their targets, destroyed by some kind of energy field the colonists had never seen before. The Ravager ships moved like living things through space. They curved and twisted around the defensive, fire with an organic grace that made Taeho's stomach turn. Their hulls were dark and smooth, covered in what looked like armor plating that shifted and rippled as they moved. When they finally opened fire on the defense platforms, their weapons made no sound that the colony's sensors could detect. The platforms simply exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Taeho's father grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the emergency exit. "Get to the mining bay," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Take Hauler 7 and get into the asteroid field. Hide among the rocks until this is over." But Taeho hesitated. Through the command center's windows, he could see the Ravager ships beginning their attack on the colony itself. Buildings exploded in sequence as the alien weapons carved through the settlement's defensive shields like they weren't even there. He saw the school where he had learned basic mathematics and stellar navigation disappear in a ball of fire. The medical center where Dr. Sujin had treated his broken arm when he was 12 years old crumbled into dust and debris. "I'm not leaving you," Taeho said, but his father was already pushing him toward the door. "You have to survive," his father replied. "Someone has to tell the galaxy what happened here." Those were the last words they spoke to each other. Taeho ran through the corridors of the mining complex as explosions shook the walls around him. Emergency lights flickered on and off, casting crazy shadows that made everything look like a nightmare. He could hear screaming from somewhere behind him, but he didn't stop to look back. Hauler 7 was an old ship, nearly 20 years past its recommended retirement date. Taeho's father had kept it running through constant maintenance and stubborn determination. It wasn't fast or pretty, but it was reliable, and Taeho knew every bolt and wire in its hull. He had practically grown up in its pilot seat, learning to navigate the asteroid field while his father hauled ore to the processing stations. He launched the hauler just as the first Ravager ships began landing on the planet's surface. Through the ship's rear cameras, he watched the mining complex explode into a cloud of metal and flame. Everything he had ever known was gone in less than 10 minutes. The asteroid field had always been Taeho's playground, but now it became his fortress. He guided the hauler deep into the maze of floating rocks, using his intimate knowledge of their positions and orbital patterns to stay hidden. The Ravager ships seemed to lose interest in the asteroids once the colony was destroyed. They congregated around the planet, doing something that Taeho couldn't understand with their scanning equipment. For 6 hours, he waited among the rocks and watched the aliens work. They were harvesting something from the colony's ruins, loading containers with materials that might have been anything from precious metals to human remains. Taeho felt sick thinking about what they might be taking, but he forced himself to keep watching. His father had told him to survive so he could tell others what happened, and that meant he needed to understand everything he could about these creatures. That's when he started to notice patterns in their behavior. The Ravager ships moved in specific formations, with certain vessels always taking point while others provided support. They communicated through some kind of energy pulse that his ship's sensors could barely detect. Most importantly, they seemed to follow predictable routes when moving between the planet and their collection points. Taeho had grown up hunting space debris in the asteroid field. His father had taught him to track the movement of rocks and metal fragments, to predict where they would be minutes or hours in the future. Now he applied those same skills to tracking alien warships, and he began to see opportunities. The first attack came 18 hours after the colony died. Tae-ho had positioned his hauler behind a large asteroid, using its bulk to hide his ship's energy signature. When a lone Ravager scout ship passed nearby, following the same route it had used 6 times before, Tae-ho fired a mining charge directly into its path. Mining charges were designed to break apart large asteroids for easier processing. They weren't weapons, but they contained enough explosive power to crack rock that had been compressed for millions of years. When the charge detonated against the Ravager ship's hull, the alien vessel broke apart like it was made of glass. The explosion seemed to confuse the other Ravager ships. They had expected no resistance after destroying the colony's defenses, and the sudden attack from the asteroid field caught them completely off guard. They began sending ships to investigate, but Tae-ho was already moving to a new position, using the asteroid field's natural cover to stay hidden. The second attack came 4 hours later. This time, Tae-ho used the hauler's drilling laser, modifying its focus to create a beam that could cut through alien armor. He waited until 3 Ravager ships were flying in close formation, then fired the laser through a gap between 2 asteroids. The beam sliced through all 3 ships before they could react. By the end of the first day, Tae-ho had destroyed 8 Ravager vessels. He was learning their tactics, understanding how they thought and moved. They were hunters, used to overwhelming their prey through superior numbers and firepower. They had never faced an enemy who refused to stand and fight, who struck from hiding and disappeared before they could respond. The mining hauler wasn't built for combat, but Tae-ho's father had taught him to be creative with limited resources. He turned ore containers into kinetic missiles, launching them at high speed toward enemy ships. He used the ship's magnetic grapples to grab asteroids and fling them at pursuing vessels. He even figured out how to vent the ship's waste disposal system in a way that created a temporary sensor blind spot. Each victory made the Ravagers more cautious, but it also made them more determined to find him. They began working in larger groups, scanning the asteroid field with increasingly sophisticated equipment. Tae-ho had to become smarter and more desperate with each passing hour. On the second day, he discovered that Ravager ships had a weakness in their rear shields. The energy field that protected them from frontal attacks didn't extend fully around their hulls. By using the asteroid field's gravitational effects to approach from unexpected angles, Tae-ho could hit them where they were vulnerable. On the third day, he realized that the aliens' communication system created interference with their own sensors. By positioning himself near their command ships when they were coordinating attacks, he could move almost undetected while they were distracted by their own signals. The battle became a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the asteroids. Tae-ho would strike and disappear, wearing down the Ravager fleet through constant harassment. He was fighting not just for his own survival, but for revenge against the creatures who had murdered his family and destroyed his home. By the end of the third day, 47 Ravager ships had been destroyed by a single human in a mining hauler that should have been scrapped years ago. The remaining alien vessels finally retreated, apparently deciding that whatever they had come to harvest wasn't worth the continued losses. Tae-ho sat alone in his father's ship, surrounded by the debris of an impossible victory, and wept for everything he had lost. The days following Commander Choi's presentation became a whirlwind of analysis and debate throughout the academy. Every tactical instructor wanted to study the footage from different angles, and every student had theories about how the impossible victory had been achieved. The mess halls buzzed with conversations about the mysterious pilot, and simulation rooms were booked solid as cadets tried to recreate the battle scenarios. Tae-ho found himself caught in the middle of discussions he desperately wanted to avoid. During meals, other cadets would ask him what he thought about the tactics used in the footage. He would mumble something non-committal and change the subject, but his classmates seemed to interpret his reluctance to discuss the battle as thoughtful analysis rather than personal discomfort. Professor Min-Soo Kang had taken over one of the Academy's main lecture halls to present his analysis of the physics involved in the battle. He was a thin man with wild gray hair who had spent most of his career studying theoretical applications of gravitational mechanics. Now he stood before a room full of confused cadets and instructors, gesturing at complex equations that covered 3 holographic displays. The gravitational calculations required for these maneuvers are simply beyond human capability, Professor Kang explained to his audience. To use asteroid gravitational fields as slingshots while engaged in combat requires real-time processing of thousands of variables. The position and velocity of each rock, the gravitational interaction between multiple bodies, the effect of engine thrust on trajectory. No human brain could handle this level of computation. Cadet Yujin Nam raised her hand from the front row. She had been attending every analysis session since the footage was first shown, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions. Professor, what if the pilot had extensive experience navigating that particular asteroid field? Could familiarity with the local conditions explain the tactical choices? Professor Kang shook his head emphatically. Experience might explain basic navigation, but what we see in this footage goes far beyond that. The pilot is using gravitational effects to accelerate their ship beyond its design specifications, timing engine burns to coincide with gravitational peaks in ways that suggest an intuitive understanding of physics that shouldn't be possible. Instructor Yun-Sik stood up from where he had been observing near the back of the room. The tall Valkyrian's 4 eyes could track multiple objects simultaneously, giving his species natural advantages in tactical analysis. I have reviewed the footage frame by frame using our most advanced analysis equipment, he said in his melodious voice. The pilot appears to be predicting Ravager attack patterns with accuracy that borders on precognition. They consistently position themselves exactly where enemy fire will not be, often before the enemy ships have even begun their attack runs. This statement caused a stir among the assembled cadets and instructors. Precognition was the stuff of fantasy stories, not military tactics. Several people began talking at once, their voices rising as they debated the implications. Commander Choi stood and raised her hand for silence. Let's focus on what we can verify rather than speculating about impossible abilities. The tactical. Computer has identified 17 distinct maneuvers in the footage that violate established combat doctrine. Each one individually might be explained as luck or desperate improvisation, but taken together, they suggest a level of tactical innovation that challenges our understanding of human capabilities. She activated a new holographic display showing a 3-dimensional map of the asteroid field. Red lines traced the path of the mining hauler through the battle, while blue lines showed the movement of Ravager ships. The pattern that emerged looked almost like a dance, with the human ship weaving between enemy vessels in sequences that seemed to follow some hidden rhythm. What troubles me most, Commander Choi continued, is that many of these tactics would only work against this specific enemy. The pilot somehow understood Ravager psychology and attack patterns despite humanity having no previous contact with this species. They exploited weaknesses in alien technology that our xenotechnology department is still trying to understand. Admiral Hana Park entered the lecture hall just as Commander Choi finished speaking. The academy director was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had commanded fleets during the Outer Rim Wars and was considered one of the most brilliant strategic minds in human space. Every cadet and instructor in the room stood at attention when she appeared. "At ease," Admiral Park said, waving for everyone to sit down. "I've been reviewing the analysis reports from all departments, and I have some additional information that might shed light on our mystery pilot." She walked to the front of the room and activated her own holographic display. This one showed the mining hauler in extreme detail, with every identifying mark and registration number clearly visible. "The ship in the footage is registered as mining vessel KM-4421TK, Admiral Park announced. It belonged to Captain Jinwoo Kim, who operated a small family mining business in the Kepler system. Captain Kim was killed in the initial Ravager attack along with his wife and 2 daughters. Tae-ho felt his stomach drop. He had hoped that his father's ship would be too damaged for anyone to identify, but the Admiral's research teams were apparently more thorough than he had expected. Around the room, people were beginning to make connections. Captain Kim had one son, Admiral Park continued, who was listed as missing and presumed dead after the attack. However, 3 weeks ago, that same son enrolled in our academy under emergency refugee protocols. The silence in the room was deafening. Tae-ho could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him, but he kept staring straight ahead at the holographic display. His hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails were digging into his palms. "Cadet Tae-ho Kim," Admiral Park said quietly. "Would you please stand up?" Tae-ho remained seated for a long moment, hoping that somehow this was all a nightmare he would wake up from. But the weight of attention from everyone in the room was impossible to ignore. Slowly, Reluctantly, he got to his feet. The room erupted in whispers and exclamations. Cadets were turning in their seats to stare at him, and instructors were consulting their datapads to confirm what they had just heard. Tae-ho stood motionless in the center of the chaos, feeling like he was drowning in a sea of voices. "The ghost of Kepler 442b," someone whispered, and the phrase spread through the room like wildfire. That's what some of the news reports had called the unknown pilot, a mysterious figure who had appeared from nowhere to achieve an impossible victory before vanishing again. Dong-woo was staring at his roommate with his mouth hanging open. "Tae-ho," he said quietly. "That was really you in the footage?" Tae-ho nodded once, a tiny movement that somehow seemed to confirm everything. The whispers in the room grew louder as cadets began discussing the implications. The quiet boy who sat in the back of every class and rarely spoke was actually the greatest individual military hero in recent human history. Professor Kang was frantically recalculating his equations, muttering to himself about the impossibility of what he had witnessed. Instructor Yeon-sik was studying Tae-ho with all four of his eyes, as if trying to understand how such an unremarkable-looking human could have accomplished something so extraordinary. Commander Choi stepped forward and addressed Tae-ho directly. "Cadet Kim, can you explain how you managed to perform those gravitational slingshot maneuvers without computer assistance?" Tae-ho opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could he explain that he had grown up in that asteroid field, that his father had taught him to read the subtle gravitational currents like other children learned to read books? How could he describe the desperate fury that had driven him to push his father's ship beyond all reasonable limits? "I knew the rocks," he finally managed to say, his voice barely audible in the large room. "My father taught me to fly there when I was 8 years old. I've been navigating that field for half my life." "But the tactical decisions," Instructor Yeon-sik pressed. "How did you know where the Ravager ships would be? Our analysis suggests you were consistently ahead of their movements." Tae-ho closed his eyes and remembered the rage that had consumed him during those 3 days. "They killed my family," he said simply. "I watched them work for hours before I started fighting back. I learned their patterns, and I wanted them to suffer for what they did." The room fell silent again. In those few words, Tae-ho had revealed the truth that all their sophisticated analysis had missed. The impossible victory hadn't been achieved through superior technology or advanced training. It had been powered by grief and determination and an absolutely unbreakable refusal to let his family's killers escape unpunished. Admiral Park nodded slowly, as if she understood something that the others were still struggling to grasp. "Cadet Kim, I think we need to have a private conversation. Everyone else, this briefing is concluded." As the room began to empty, Tae-ho remained standing where he was, surrounded by the ghosts of his impossible victory and the weight of a legend he had never wanted to become. Admiral Park's office was located at the top of Nexus Station's command tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a view of the surrounding starfield. Tae-ho sat in a comfortable chair across from her desk, but he felt anything but comfortable. The weight of revelation hung heavy in the air between them, and he could sense that his life at the academy was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. The Admiral poured 2 cups of tea from a service set that looked like it had been crafted on Earth. The familiar aroma reminded Tae-ho of mornings in his family's kitchen, when his mother would prepare breakfast while his father planned the day's mining operations. The memory was painful, but somehow comforting. "Tell me about your father," Admiral Park said as she handed him one of the cups. Her voice was gentle, without the commanding tone she used during official briefings. Tae-ho wrapped his hands around the warm cup and stared into the pale green liquid. "He was a good man. He taught me everything about asteroid mining, about reading gravitational currents and predicting rock movements. He said that space was dangerous enough without taking unnecessary risks, so preparation and knowledge were the only things that kept miners alive." "How long had your family operated in the Kepler system?" 15 years. My father bought the mining rights when I was 3 years old. We moved there from Earth because he said the asteroid belt had enough rare metals to make us wealthy if we worked hard enough." Tae-ho took a sip of tea and felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He was right, eventually. The business was doing well before. He didn't finish the sentence, but Admiral Park nodded in understanding. I've read the reports about the attack. The colony had no warning, no time to prepare defenses. Most mining operations assume that their remote locations provide natural protection from hostile forces. The Ravagers came out of hyperspace right on top of us, Tejo said quietly. By the time our sensors detected them, they were already firing on the defense platforms. My father said he'd never seen ships move like that, so fast and coordinated, like they were all controlled by a single mind. Admiral Park activated a holographic display that showed the tactical analysis of the battle. The three-dimensional representation of the asteroid field appeared between them, with the paths of ships traced in different colored lines. Commander Choi and her team have been studying every frame of the battle footage. They identified 47 Ravager vessels destroyed over the course of 72 hours. Can you walk me through what happened during those 3 days? Tejo stared at the holographic display and felt himself transported back to the cockpit of his father's mining hauler. The first day was mostly hiding and watching. I stayed deep in the asteroid field where their sensors couldn't track me easily, but I could see what they were doing to the colony, harvesting equipment and materials. They worked in patterns, same routes between the planet and their collection points. He pointed to several locations in the holographic field. I knew every rock in that area, every gravitational anomaly and orbital pattern. When I saw a chance to take out one of their scout ships, I used a mining charge. It wasn't supposed to be a weapon, but my father had taught me that mining explosives could crack asteroids 3 times larger than their rated capacity if you place them correctly. The tactical analysis suggests you were using gravitational slingshot effects to increase your ship's speed and maneuverability, Admiral Park said. That requires extremely precise calculations. Not calculations, Tejo replied, shaking his head. Instinct. I'd been flying in that field since I was 8 years old. My father would take me on mining runs and teach me to feel the gravitational currents, to sense when rocks were going to shift or when there was a clear path through a dense cluster. He said computers could tell you the math, but experienced pilots could feel the field in their bones. The Admiral leaned forward with interest. You're saying you were navigating by intuition rather than sensor data? The hauler's main computer was damaged in the first hour of fighting. I was flying on emergency power with minimal sensors, but I didn't need sensors to navigate the field. I knew it better than I knew the layout of our house. Tejo traced one of the attack routes with his finger. This sequence here, where I took out 3 ships in rapid succession, I was using the gravitational wake from a large asteroid to accelerate beyond the hauler's normal top speed. The Ravagers couldn't predict my trajectory because their computers don't account for local gravitational effects. Admiral Park made notes on her datapad as Tejo explained his tactics. What about their attack patterns? The analysis shows you were consistently avoiding their fire even when multiple ships were targeting you simultaneously. Tejo was quiet for a long moment, remembering the rage that had driven him through those 3 days of fighting. I watched them for 6 hours before I started fighting back. They move like hunters, but they're used to prey that runs away or fights back predictably. They have standard attack formations for different situations, and they stick to those patterns even when they're not working. You learned their psychology by observation? I learned to hate them, Tejo said simply. Every ship I destroyed was payment for my family. Every tactic I used was designed to make them suffer the way they made us suffer. They expected me to run or hide until they found me. Instead, I hunted them. The holographic display shifted to show the final phase of the battle, when the remaining Ravager ships had retreated from the system. Admiral Park studied the data carefully before speaking again. According to the sensor logs, you had opportunities to escape during the second day. There were several windows when you could have jumped to hyperspace and fled the system. Why didn't you take them? Tejo set down his teacup and looked directly at the Admiral. Because then, they would have gotten away with it. They murdered 3,000 innocent people, including my family, and they were going to leave with whatever they came to steal. I couldn't let that happen. Even though staying meant you would probably die? I was already dead, Tejo replied. Everything I cared about was gone. The only choice I had left was whether to die for nothing or die making them pay for what they did. Admiral Park turned off the holographic display and leaned back in her chair. But you didn't die. You survived, and your actions saved valuable intelligence about a new hostile species. The data recovered from destroyed Ravager ships has given our xenobiology teams crucial insights into their technology and biology. I didn't know that at the time. I was just trying to hurt them as much as possible before they killed me. That's what makes your achievement so remarkable, the Admiral said. You weren't following any tactical doctrine or strategic plan. You were improvising with mining equipment against a superior enemy force, motivated entirely by grief and determination. And somehow you accomplished something that our best tactical computers classify as impossible. Taeho shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It doesn't feel remarkable. It feels like failure. I couldn't save anyone who mattered. You saved the galaxy from an enemy we knew nothing about, Admiral Park countered. Your battle provided the first detailed intelligence on Ravager capabilities and tactics. That information has already been distributed to every military installation in human space. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the stars. The question now is what we do with you. Every instructor at this academy wants to study your tactical methods. The media is demanding interviews with the ghost of Kepler 442b. Military analysts are trying to develop training programs based on your improvised techniques. I just want to be left alone, Taeho said quietly. Admiral, Park turned back to face him. I'm afraid that's not an option anymore. Whether you wanted it or not, you've become a symbol of human determination and ingenuity. More importantly, you have skills and insights that could save countless lives in future conflicts. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to share what you know. Teach other pilots how to think creatively under pressure. Help us understand how human intuition can supplement tactical computers. Show us how determination and personal motivation can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Taeho was quiet for a long time, considering the weight of what she was asking. Finally, he spoke. My father used to say that knowledge was only valuable if you shared it with people who needed it. He taught me everything he knew about asteroid mining because he wanted me to be better than he was. And now you have knowledge that could make our military forces better than they are, Admiral Park said. Taeho nodded slowly. If it means other colonies won't suffer the way Kepler 442b did, then I'll do whatever you need me to do. Admiral. Park smiled for the first time since he'd entered her office. Then welcome to your new assignment, Instructor Kim. 6 months later, Taeho stood in front of his first official class as an instructor at the Stellar Defense Academy. The lecture hall was packed with senior cadets and junior officers from across the galaxy, all eager to learn from the legendary Ghost of Kepler 442b. He still felt uncomfortable with the title, but he had learned to accept that it was part of his identity now. The students in front of him were different from the cadets he had studied alongside just months earlier. These were experienced pilots and tactical officers, many with years of combat experience. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, wondering what a 19-year-old human could teach them about warfare that they didn't already know. My name is Taeho Kim, he began, his voice carrying easily through the large room. 6 months ago, I was sitting in the back row of this same lecture hall, watching footage of a battle that I hoped no one would ever connect to me. Today, I'm here to teach you the lessons I learned during the worst 3 days of my life. He activated the holographic display that now showed a detailed recreation of the Kepler 442b asteroid field. The rocks floated in their ancient patterns, unchanged by the battle that had made the system famous throughout human space. The first lesson is this: everything you think you know about your limitations is probably wrong. Military doctrine teaches us to engage enemies with superior firepower and tactical support. But sometimes you don't have those advantages. Sometimes all you have is determination and the willingness to try things that seem impossible. A Velkarian officer in the third row raised one of his 4 hands. Instructor Kim, our analysis suggests that many of your tactical decisions were based on intuitive knowledge of local conditions. How do we train pilots to develop that kind of environmental awareness? Taeho nodded. It was a good question, one that he had been working on with the Academy's curriculum development team. You can't replicate 15 years of experience in a few months of training, but you can teach pilots to observe their environment more carefully, and to think creatively about the resources available to them. He changed the display to show a simulation exercise that he had designed with Commander Choi. This scenario places a single pilot in an unfamiliar asteroid field with a damaged ship and minimal weapons. The pilot must survive for 24 hours against superior enemy forces using only improvised tactics and environmental advantages. Cadet Yoo-Jin Nam, who had been promoted to senior status after exceptional performance in her xenobiology studies, raised her hand. What's the success rate for this exercise? Less than 5%, Taeho admitted. But that's not the point. The goal isn't to achieve victory in an impossible situation. The goal is to teach pilots to keep fighting and thinking creatively even when victory seems impossible. Sometimes the act of refusing to give up creates opportunities that didn't exist before. He paused the display and looked directly at his students. During the battle at Kepler 442b, I was fighting for revenge, not for victory. I didn't expect to survive, and I didn't have a strategic plan beyond making the Ravagers pay for what they had done. But my refusal to accept defeat created tactical opportunities that changed the outcome of the battle. An older human officer with captain's insignia spoke up. Instructor, how do we balance emotional motivation with tactical discipline? Military training emphasizes controlled responses to combat situations. Taeho had struggled with this question himself. During his months of intensive debriefing with military psychologists and tactical analysts, he had learned to understand his own actions in ways that were useful for training others. Emotional motivation can be a powerful force multiplier, but it has to be channeled properly, he replied. My anger at the Ravagers gave me the determination to keep fighting when any rational person would have fled or surrendered. But if I had let that anger control my tactics completely, I would have made mistakes that got me killed. He activated a new section of the display showing one of his most successful attack sequences. This maneuver required precise timing and careful positioning. I had to put aside my desire for immediate revenge and think strategically about how to maximize damage while minimizing risk. The emotion powered my determination, but experience and training guided my actions. Instructor Yeon-sik entered the lecture hall and took a seat near the back. Over the past months, the Valkyrian professor had become one of Taeho's most valuable colleagues, helping him understand how his intuitive tactical decisions could be translated into teachable principles. The second lesson, Taeho continued, is that unconventional thinking can be more valuable than superior technology. The Ravagers had better ships, better weapons, and better sensors, but they also had predictable tactical doctrines that I could exploit once I understood their patterns. He showed footage of one of his most audacious attacks, where he had used the mining hauler's waste disposal system to create a sensor blind spot that allowed him to approach undetected. Military equipment is designed for specific purposes, but creative pilots can find alternative applications that enemy forces don't expect. A young ensign from the engineering track looked puzzled. How do we train pilots to think of equipment modifications during combat? That seems like something that requires extensive technical knowledge. It requires curiosity more than knowledge, Taeho answered. My father taught me to understand how every system on his ship worked, not just how to operate them. When you truly understand your tools, you can imagine new ways to use them. The class continued for 2 hours, with Taeho walking his students through tactical scenarios that challenged conventional military thinking. He showed them how to use environmental hazards as weapons, how to turn defensive equipment into offensive tools, and how to exploit enemy psychology to create tactical advantages. After the class ended, Dongwoo waited for Taeho near the lecture hall exit. His former roommate had been assigned to the Academy's logistics division, where his engineering skills were being put to good use developing new training equipment. You're getting better at this teaching thing, Dongwoo said as they walked through the corridors together. Remember when you wouldn't say more than 10 words during an entire meal? Taeho smiled slightly. Admiral Park says that sharing knowledge is the best way to honor the people we've lost. Every pilot who learns to think creatively might save lives that would otherwise be lost to conventional thinking. They paused at a window overlooking the station's main docking bay, where ships from dozens of different species came and went in a constant stream of interstellar traffic. The sight reminded Taeho of the mining ships he had watched as a child, coming and going from the asteroid fields of Kepler 442b. Do you ever regret becoming famous? Dongwoo asked quietly. Taeho considered the question carefully. His life had changed dramatically since his identity as the ghost of Kepler 442b had been revealed. He received constant requests for interviews and appearances. Military academies throughout human space wanted him to visit and share his experiences. Publishers had offered enormous sums for his autobiography. "I regret that it was necessary," he finally answered. "I would give anything to have my family back and my old life restored. But since that's impossible, I'm glad that their deaths led to something that might prevent other families from suffering the same loss." A group of first-year cadets passed by in the corridor, and Taeho heard one of them whisper excitedly about seeing the famous instructor in person. He had learned to tolerate the attention, though he still preferred the quiet moments when he could work on curriculum development or tactical analysis without being treated like a celebrity. "Admiral Park wants me to address the graduation ceremony next week," Taeho said as they resumed walking. "She says the graduating class needs to understand that determination and creativity are just as important as technology and training." "What are you going to tell them?" Taeho thought about the young officers who would soon be assigned to ships throughout the galaxy, carrying the responsibility for protecting human colonies and interests. Many of them would face situations where their training and equipment weren't sufficient to guarantee victory. "I'm going to tell them that humans don't break," he said finally. "We adapt, we overcome, and we make sure that tragedy leads to wisdom that protects others." As they walked through the bustling corridors of Nexus Station, Taeho reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrible day when the Ravagers had destroyed everything he cared about. He was no longer the quiet cadet who sat in the back of lecture halls, hoping to remain unnoticed. He had become something he never expected or wanted: a teacher, a symbol, and a guardian of knowledge purchased with unbearable loss. But perhaps that was what his father would have wanted. Captain Jin-Woo Kim had always believed that knowledge should be shared with those who needed it, and now his son was sharing the most important lessons he had ever learned with pilots who might face similar impossible odds. The ghost of Kepler 442b had become Instructor Kim, and in that transformation, the legacy of 3,000 murdered colonists lived on in every student who learned to fight creatively, to think unconventionally, and to never surrender hope even in the darkest circumstances.